Some crimes are not buried in graves, but in memory itself. It begins with a shuttered house in Bloomsbury, where a historian's death was written off as nature's doing. Yet a hidden journal whispered otherwise, and Holmes would not allow the silence to prevail. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour of truth is upon us. Let us walk with Holmes into the fog, where forgotten crimes demand remembrance. Of all the strange and varied experiences which I shared with my friend Sherlock Holmes, there are some which remain but faintly etched upon the public mind, having been too swiftly buried by official neglect or convenient silence. Yet, though forgotten by Scotland Yard and omitted from the chronicles of justice, they cling with particular vividness to my own recollection. Among these singular cases stands one which, had it not been for Holmes's characteristic perseverance, might have slipped entirely into the shadows. I confess even now that the peculiar circumstances attending it seem to mark it out as something different from the ordinary run of crime. There was about it a sense not merely of mystery, but of deliberate suppression, as though unseen hands had conspired to erase both cause and consequence. It was on a raw evening, when the autumn fog rolled in dense banks through the London streets, muffling the clatter of hoofs and dimming the glow of lamps, that the first threads of this forgotten case were drawn together. The fire burned brightly in our sitting room in Baker Street, and Holmes lay stretched upon the settee, his long, thin fingers tapping upon the arm in restless impatience. I, who had grown accustomed to these fits of silent expectancy, could not resist the feeling that some unknown event was already on its way to us, heralded by the atmosphere of suppressed tension which pervaded the room. Holmes that evening displayed an agitation which bespoke a mind too keenly attuned to every vibration of the outer world to endure the stagnation of idleness. His eyes gleamed in the firelight, and the sharp profile of his features stood out against the smoke which curled from his pipe. More than once he rose abruptly, paced the room with long strides, and then subsided again upon the couch, as though compelled by sheer force of habit to await the inevitable. "You anticipate something," I ventured. He gave me a brief, half-amused glance. "Do you not also, Watson? The very air seems laden with expectancy. There are footsteps which hesitate upon the threshold of our lives, though as yet we do not know the direction from which they shall come." I smiled at his imagery, yet there was in truth a peculiar stillness about the evening, as though London itself waited for some drama to unfold. It was in this mood of hushed suspense that the bell at Baker Street rang with a sudden insistence, its harsh jangle startling us from our reverie and signalling the arrival of a visitor whose presence was destined to disturb the ordered silence of the yard itself. The man who was presently ushered into our sitting room could not have been more than 26, yet his face was pallid with fatigue, and his manner betrayed a nervousness bordering upon alarm. He was plainly but respectably dressed, and in his hand he carried a small leather satchel which he clutched as though it contained the whole of his earthly fortunes. "My name is Geoffrey Hale," said he, in a voice which trembled despite his effort to master it. "I am a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, and I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, because there is no other quarter to which I dare turn." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Pray be seated, Mr. Hale. You need not fear that what you say here shall travel beyond these walls, unless by your wish." The young man dropped wearily into the chair and passed his hand across his brow. "It is a matter," he said slowly, "which Scotland Yard has chosen to forget. Indeed, to bury so completely that I had almost doubted my own reason in pursuing it further. But I have stumbled upon a truth which leaves me no rest. My uncle, a man of learning and honour, was murdered, though all the world was told he had died of natural causes." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes kindling with interest. "And the Yard has chosen oblivion. Continue, Mr. Hale. You could not have come to me with a more fitting problem." "6 years ago," said Hale, "my uncle, Dr. Edmund Hale, a historian of considerable repute, was discovered lifeless in his study at Bloomsbury. The verdict, signed and sealed within hours, was heart failure. He was a man advanced in years, yet vigorous and unbroken in health. His friends murmured, but the authorities silenced them with curt assurances. The case was dismissed as unworthy of inquiry, and life moved on. Hale paused, his features tightening with suppressed emotion. But there were things which troubled me then, though I was too young to press them. The position of the chair, the scattered papers upon the desk, the frightened account of the housekeeper who swore she had heard voices in the room before the end. All were disregarded. To Scotland Yard, it was but another citizen felled by nature, and so the affair was swiftly closed. Holmes's expression had grown intent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. And you, Mr. Hale, have found reason to reopen what they were so eager to dismiss? The young man bent his head. Yes, I have found reason, though the reason has already placed my own safety in peril. It is for that reason I have dared to intrude upon your time tonight. With a gesture that betrayed both fear and resolution, Hale opened his satchel and drew forth a small, time-worn volume. Its leather binding was cracked, and the pages within were dense with the cramped hand of a scholar. This, said he, was concealed within a recess of my uncle's desk, discovered only when the house was recently set in order. The entries are disjointed, almost cryptic, but they speak of research into certain documents, of enemies who feared exposure, and of an unease that grew until the very night of his death. It is, I am convinced, the testament of a man who foresaw his end. Holmes accepted the volume with reverent care, turning the leaves swiftly yet attentively. His lips tightened as he read. Interesting, most interesting. A voice from the grave, Watson, calling for remembrance where all else is silence. Hale's composure faltered at last, and he leaned forward with a sudden intensity. Since I found that journal, Mr. Holmes, I have been watched. Faces follow me in the streets. My rooms have been entered in my absence. Twice I have heard footsteps outside my very door at night. I am convinced that there are those who would silence me as they silenced him. Holmes closed the journal, his gaze steady upon the young man. Then you are right to come here. For if Scotland Yard has forgotten, we shall remember. And memory, Mr. Hale, is a weapon sharper than any blade. It was upon the following afternoon that Holmes announced his intention of visiting the house where Dr. Edmund Hale had breathed his last. Geoffrey Hale, pale yet resolute, met us in Baker Street and accompanied us through the dense and clamorous traffic of Holborn into the quieter quarter of Bloomsbury, where the residence still stood, shuttered and unlived in, like some mausoleum of forgotten scholarship. The fog, that eternal shroud of London, lay thick about the squares and narrow streets. Our cab moved slowly, the horses' hooves muffled upon the greasy pavement, while the lamps glowed like wan stars through the gloom. I could not suppress a sense of foreboding as we drew up before the sombre facade of the house, its windows blinded with dust, its door locked against intrusion. Hale's hand shook as he produced the key. I have entered here but once since his death, he whispered. It is as though the rooms remember him too vividly, and I confess the place unnerves me. Holmes's keen eyes regarded the young man for a moment. We seek not the shades of memory, but the footprints of fact, he said briskly. Steel yourself, Mr. Hale. We go not into the past, but into the truth. Together we crossed the threshold. The silence within was profound, broken only by the groan of the hinges and the echo of our steps. The air was heavy with the odour of neglect, and a fine dust lay upon the floor, marking it as a place abandoned to time. Holmes's nostrils flared slightly, as though scenting some unspoken story. With that singular quickening of energy, which bespoke his anticipation of discovery, he motioned us towards the study where the tragedy had once played itself out. The study was a square, gloomy chamber, lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of musty tomes. A great mahogany desk stood near the window, its surface still littered with papers yellowed by the years. Everything bore that peculiar air of arrested time, as though the hand of death had frozen the room at the precise instant of its master's departure. Holmes advanced at once to the desk his thin figure bent, his eyes darting across the disordered surface. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The dust tells us more than words. These sheets have not been disturbed in 6 years, yet here." He touched the edge of the desk. "The surface is broken, the grains scattered by pressure." I bent closer and perceived faint scratches where the wood had been scraped, almost as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Holmes examined them with his lens, his expression sharpening. "These are no accidents. They mark an interference, one deliberate enough to leave its record for posterity. What was taken from here, and by whom, is a question which already begins to shape itself." Geoffrey Hale gazed with wide eyes. "But Mr. Holmes, the police—" "Saw what they wished to see," Holmes interrupted curtly. "There is little profit in reproaching them. It is for us to read the language they ignored." He moved about the chamber with noiseless step, pausing by the curtains, the chair, and finally the floor near the hearth. His gaze roved as if each mote of dust carried a tale. At length he returned to the desk, his long fingers trailing lightly over its surface. Scratches, dust disturbed, papers awry. "Watson, the room whispers of intrusion. It remains only to determine whether that intrusion was before the death or after." As he spoke, I felt the oppressive weight of the chamber press more heavily upon me, as though secrets slumbered beneath the dust, waiting for Holmes to rouse them from their long sleep. Upon the corner of the desk lay a stub of candle, its wick blackened, its surface run with hardened rivulets of wax. Holmes took it up between finger and thumb, turning it this way and that under the light. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire which I had learned to associate with discovery. "See here, Watson," said he. "A common candle, yet an uncommon witness. Note the depth of the guttering and the irregularity of the melt. This is no natural extinguishing. It has been allowed to burn to excess, and in an environment where time, I suspect, was of fatal significance." I examined it closely. To my eye it was but an ordinary object, yet in Holmes's hand it seemed to assume an importance almost sinister. "Consider," he went on, "the verdict of sudden heart failure. Would a man thus stricken leave a candle to waste itself unattended? Or does it rather suggest that another lingered here after the scholar's fall, unwilling to sit in darkness, yet unwilling to summon assistance?" Hale gave a sharp intake of breath. "Then someone was with him?" "Indubitably," Holmes replied. "The candle testifies. It burned beyond its natural use, marking not death alone, but presence, another's presence. And that, Mr. Hale, is the first nail in the coffin of Scotland Yard's convenient verdict." He replaced the stub with a delicacy one might reserve for a relic, then turned to me with the half-smile that so often heralded greater revelations. "Already the room begins to speak, Watson. Let us listen closely, for it has not yet told us all." Holmes had been moving slowly about the study, his eyes roving with that hawk-like intensity, which never failed to impress me, when he paused suddenly before the hearthrug. Dropping to one knee, he pressed the floorboards with his hand, then produced his knife and levered the corner of one plank. A faint creak sounded, and with deft fingers he prized the board upwards, revealing the dust-choked cavity beneath. "Watson," he murmured, beckoning me closer. "Your medical eye, if you please." I bent over the opening, and even in the dim light I saw what he had already perceived. There, sunk into the grain of the timber, was a dark stain, long since dried, but with that peculiar hue which no physician could mistake. It was blood, human blood, which had soaked into the very floor of the room. Holmes's expression was grim as he replaced the board. So, the scholar's heart did not fail him unaided. Here is evidence which nature herself could not have contrived. Violence, Watson, concealed and ignored. Scotland Yard, in its haste, chose blindness. Geoffrey Hale shuddered visibly, his lips tightening as he fought for composure. "Then it is true," he whispered. "My uncle did not die as they claimed." Holmes gave a sharp nod. The room has confessed, and its testimony is more eloquent than any witness. Yet we must look beyond the stain, for blood tells us of death, but not of the hand that shed it. To find that hand, we must listen to those who still remember. It was Holmes's wish that we should speak with the old housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, who had tended the historian's household at the time of his death. She was summoned from her modest lodgings nearby, and I watched with interest as Holmes regarded her with his keen, penetrating gaze. The woman, bent with years yet sharp of tongue, curtsied awkwardly before us. "I told them then, sir," she said, her voice quavering with the indignation of one long ignored, "but they would have none of it. They said I fancied things, that I was old and half blind. But I know what I heard." Holmes inclined his head encouragingly. "What was it you heard, Mrs. Bellamy?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "A gentleman came to the house that night. I did not see his face, for he wore his hat low and his cloak high. But I heard his voice. He asked for the master, and they shut themselves in the study. Later, much later, I heard a cry, but by then I dared not go near. When the doctor said it was his heart, they told me to keep quiet, and so I did." Holmes's eyes flashed with triumph. "Ignored, Watson, though here lies the very thread. A visitor unacknowledged, a cry unheeded. What more could one ask? The Yard may dismiss, but we record." Holmes had scarcely finished questioning the woman when an exclamation from Hale drew our attention. The satchel which he had set upon the desk now lay gaping open, and the precious journal was gone. We stared in stunned silence. The window, though latched when we entered, now hung ajar, its catch forced. Holmes sprang across the room, his eyes darting into the street below. For a moment the fog swirled thick and impenetrable, but then I caught the fleeting outline of a dark figure vanishing into the mist. "Quick, Watson!" Holmes cried, but before we could reach the door, the night had swallowed the intruder whole. The empty street gave no clue, the fog hiding all as effectively as if the earth itself had opened. Holmes returned, his lips compressed in vexation. "So, the adversary watches our every step. The journal is gone, but its theft is proof more valuable still. They fear its contents, Watson, and fear is the surest guide to truth." Geoffrey Hale sank into a chair, his face ashen. "We are too late," he murmured. "Not too late," Holmes corrected firmly. "Only challenged, and the game, I assure you, has but begun." On the morning following our discovery in Bloomsbury, Holmes announced his intention of paying a visit to Scotland Yard. I confess that I regarded the enterprise with misgiving, for I knew too well the reluctance with which official ears listened to Holmes's unwelcome truths. Nevertheless, I accompanied him, and together we sought out Inspector Lestrade, who was then engaged upon some minor matter at the Yard. Lestrade greeted us with his customary mixture of courtesy and reserve. Holmes wasted no time in preliminaries. He placed before the inspector a succinct account of our findings: the scratches upon the desk, the scorched candle, the stain beneath the floorboards, and the testimony of the housekeeper. To my astonishment, Lestrade did not at once protest. He listened in silence, his heavy brows knitted, and when Holmes had concluded, he sighed deeply. "I do not deny, Mr. Holmes, that there were irregularities," said he. "But you must understand, there was pressure. The verdict was desired quickly, and from a quarter where delay was not tolerated." "Pressure?" Holmes's tone was cutting. "Then truth itself has been sacrificed to expediency. Who, pray, exerts such authority that a man's murder is swept into silence?" Lestrade shook his head. "Names I cannot give, but you may be sure that some in high places wished the matter buried. We did as we were bid." Holmes's eyes glinted coldly. "Then, Lestrade, the Yard has been made custodian not of justice, but of oblivion. It is fortunate indeed that there are still some of us willing to recall what others would forget." The inspector coloured, but made no reply. We left him thus, and I could see from Holmes's rigid features that his resolve had only deepened. It was later that day, as we reviewed the case in Baker Street, that Holmes spoke of the name Lady Eleanor Rivington, which had appeared repeatedly in Dr. Hale's journal. "She is," said Holmes, "a patron of historical societies, a woman of influence in academic circles, and a frequent correspondent of the late historian. Such associations may be innocent, or they may conceal much." By afternoon we found ourselves at her residence, where she received us with gracious composure. She was a tall woman of striking presence, her manner polished, her eyes dark and unreadable. At Holmes's courteous inquiries, she professed sorrow at the historian's untimely end and spoke warmly of his work. Yet beneath her smooth exterior, I detected a guardedness, as if each word were weighed with care before utterance. Holmes, with his customary tact, drew her into discussion of the historian's final researches. At once her manner changed. "He was pursuing shadows," she declared with sudden heat. "Dangerous shadows. He would have done better to let sleeping truths lie." "I warned him so." She broke off, and her smile returned cold and impenetrable. "But such matters are of no concern now. The poor man is gone, and his work with him." As we departed, Holmes's face wore the half-smile that told me he had gathered more from her silence than from her speech. "There, Watson, is one who cloaks much beneath her civility. Mark her words, sleeping truths. She fears their awakening." From Lady Rivington our inquiries led us to the rooms of Professor Arthur Calthorpe, a name also found in the historian's journal. He was a man of imposing intellect, though his manner bore the arrogance of one long accustomed to dispute. His walls were lined with volumes, and upon his desk lay the drafts of a work which, as he informed us with no little pride, was to be the capstone of his career. Holmes wasted no time. "You knew Dr. Edmund Hale well," said he. "Too well," Calthorpe replied bitterly. "He was a man bent on destruction, my destruction. He sought to discredit my life's work with his fanciful theories and his so-called evidence. Had he lived, he would have ruined me utterly." The words were spoken with such vehemence that I started. Holmes, however, merely regarded him with narrowed eyes. "Then his death was not without profit to you," said he quietly. The professor flushed, then laughed harshly. "If you mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes interposed calmly. "I merely note that your fortunes were preserved by his silence." As we withdrew, I saw Holmes's gaze linger upon a bundle of papers tied with ribbon upon the desk. Later, when I remarked upon it, he observed, "Calthorpe is a man with too much to lose. Desperation makes the boldest of motives. Yet we must be cautious, Watson, for the bold man often hides behind a mask more subtle than his enemies suspect." It was while reviewing the notes from Dr. Hale's journal that Holmes directed my attention to the frequent mention of one Julius Blackwood, a name then little known to me. Holmes, however, was already acquainted with the reputation of this gentleman. "Blackwood," said he, "is a financier whose enterprises in the colonies have skirted the boundaries of legality more often than his investors might suspect. Dr. Hale's researches, if they touched upon Blackwood's affairs, could have proved exceedingly inconvenient to him. At Holmes's request, we contrived to make the man's acquaintance at one of his clubs, a dim establishment thick with the haze of tobacco smoke, where speculation and rumour clung as heavily to the air as the fumes themselves. Blackwood was of middle years, florid of face, and possessed of that facile charm which veils calculation beneath a veneer of geniality. He greeted Holmes with outward courtesy, but displayed a guarded irritation at the mention of Dr. Hale's name. "A meddlesome fellow," said he, with a dismissive wave of his cigar, "ever poking into matters which did not concern him. If death claimed him, it was no more than nature's due." Holmes's eyes, cold and penetrating, lingered upon the financier longer than politeness required. "Perhaps," he said softly. "And yet, Mr. Blackwood, nature seldom acts in so timely a fashion." The man flushed, and for the briefest instant his hand trembled as it set down the glass. That momentary betrayal did not escape Holmes's notice. It was late that evening, after leaving Holmes at Baker Street, that I became aware of an uncomfortable sensation, that of being followed. The fog lay heavy upon the streets, curling in ghostly wreaths, and the lamplight struggled feebly against the darkness. More than once I fancied the echo of a footfall too regular to be chance, and the shadow of a figure retreating as I turned. Quickening my pace, I struck into side streets, yet still the pursuit continued. My heart beat faster, and I confessed to a chill which owed little to the night air. At last, by darting suddenly into a narrow passage, I gained a few moments' advantage, and when I emerged again upon the main thoroughfare, my pursuer was nowhere to be seen. I reached my rooms with no further incident, though not without a lingering dread. The following morning I hastened to Baker Street, only to find Holmes himself recounting a peril equally sinister. "Watson," said he gravely, "it appears our adversary has chosen to declare himself. Last night my cab was tampered with. A loosened wheel, artfully arranged, might have ended the matter for me had I not observed the irregular motion in time to leap clear. It was no accident. The implication was plain. Not content with watching us, the enemy had now attempted our lives." Holmes's face was calm, yet there was in his eyes a steeliness which boded ill for those who opposed him. "The shadow has lengthened, Watson," said he. "We walk now not merely in mystery, but in danger." The increasing peril weighed heavily upon Geoffrey Hale, whose natural courage began to falter beneath the sense of unseen menace. We found him one evening at his chambers, pale and agitated, the journal's loss and the recent threats pressing heavily upon his spirit. "I cannot go on, Mr. Holmes," he confessed with a trembling voice. "Since I sought the truth, I have been haunted at every step. My uncle is beyond help. Perhaps it were better to let the matter rest, lest I share his fate." Holmes regarded him with a mixture of pity and severity. "And would you, Mr. Hale, permit the assassin to triumph through your silence? Shall truth itself be strangled because men fear to speak it? Your uncle sought to uncover what others would conceal. His voice has been stilled, but yours yet remains. To falter now is to betray both him and yourself." Hale buried his face in his hands. "But what am I against such forces? They are powerful, untouchable." Holmes's voice rang firm. "Powerful, perhaps. Untouchable, never. Remember, Mr. Hale, that forgotten crimes are the most dangerous of all, for they embolden the wicked. It is memory which arms us, and it is memory which will undo them. Trust me, the net tightens." Thus admonished, the young man raised his head with renewed, though tremulous, resolve. In that moment, I understood the peculiar influence Holmes wielded over those who sought his aid. He did not merely detect crime, he compelled others to confront truth, however perilous. As we left him, Holmes turned to me with quiet intensity. "The contest has begun in earnest, Watson. We must be vigilant, for our foe is bold. Yet boldness breeds misstep, and it is upon that misstep we shall pounce." Holmes had long been famed for the peculiar vigour with which he applied himself to the smallest material clue, and I was witness, once more, to that intensity on a night not soon to be forgotten. The blinds of Baker Street were drawn, the lamps lowered, and upon the table before him stood an array of retorts, glass phials and crucibles, their contents simmering and hissing under the careful flame. The object of his scrutiny was a portion of wax scraped from the very candle which we had retrieved in the Bloomsbury study. With the precision of a chemist and the absorption of an artist, Holmes subjected the fragment to a succession of reagents, his lean face intent in the shifting glow. I, less skilled in such matters, could but watch, lending what assistance he demanded, and marvelling at the patience of his method. At length, he gave a sharp exclamation, and held aloft the cloudy residue that remained after the reaction. "Observe, Watson, an alkaloid extract of extreme rarity, compounded so as to produce a subtle yet fatal action upon the heart. The substance is nearly indistinguishable from natural failure unless one looks for it with deliberate intent." I bent closer. "You mean Dr. Hale was poisoned?" "Beyond question. The poison was concealed within the candle. As it burned, the vapour permeated the chamber, inducing failure of the cardiac system while leaving the semblance of natural death. Ingenious, Watson, and devilish. The Yard, of course, saw only what it wished to see. Holmes replaced the fragment with a kind of reverence, as though holding communion with the murdered scholar. This, my dear fellow, is proof irrefutable. He was slain not by the infirmity of years, but by the calculated treachery of man. The following day, Holmes's inquiries led us to the scholar's scattered papers, which Hale had begun to gather from his uncle's effects. Among these fragments was a half-completed manuscript, dense with references to state archives and obscure records of parliamentary debate. Holmes turned the pages rapidly, his eyes darting from one note to another, until he paused with a low whistle. "Here lies the fulcrum of our case," he declared. Dr. Hale was on the verge of exposing a scandal of grave import. These documents, if genuine, reveal the fabrication of evidence in a matter which altered the career of a statesman now held in high esteem. To prove forgery in such quarters would shake the very foundations of political life. Geoffrey Hale's face grew pale. "Then my uncle's death was the surest means of suppressing the truth," Holmes interposed, "a truth which, if published, might have destroyed reputations and unseated power itself. Do you not see, Watson, how the pattern emerges? The intrusion at the house, the stolen journal, the silence of the Yard, all point to hands which feared these revelations." I could not but feel a chill as I contemplated the forces arrayed against us, for if Holmes was correct, we were contending not with the malice of a single man, but with the influence of those who could bend even justice to their will. Holmes, however, seemed only invigorated by the danger. "There is no fortress so well guarded as a guilty secret, Watson, and none so vulnerable once the breach has begun." It was not long thereafter that new evidence, conveniently produced, cast suspicion upon Lady Eleanor Rivington. Certain letters, written in a hand resembling her own, were delivered anonymously to Scotland Yard, alleging a bitter quarrel with Dr. Hale over matters of finance and reputation. The police, ever eager for a tangible culprit, seized upon the tale with alacrity, and Lestrade himself came to Baker Street to announce the likelihood of her arrest. Holmes received the information with a calm so profound that it verged upon indifference. "Indeed, Lestrade," said he, "it would be most gratifying if crimes thus arranged could be solved by anonymous correspondence. But let us look more closely, shall we?" With that, he spread the letters upon our table. His lens travelled over the strokes, and he gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "Observe, Watson, the formation of the capitals, the hesitation of the lines. This is forgery, and clumsy forgery at that. The hand imitates, but it does not breathe. Lady Rivington is guilty of many things perhaps, but not of this." Lestrade scowled. "And yet the papers—" "Were planted," Holmes interrupted. "Planted by one who knows that suspicion, once fastened upon a plausible figure, is difficult to shake. It is an old stratagem, Lestrade, and one which would have served admirably had not closer scrutiny revealed its hollowness." As the inspector departed, muttering no small measure of irritation, Holmes turned to me with that gleam which I knew so well. "There, Watson, we glimpse the cunning of our adversary. He would sacrifice a pawn to preserve his king, but in revealing his eagerness to mislead, he has betrayed his own presence. The web tightens, and he stands ever nearer the centre." It was upon an evening of particularly dense fog that I became, for the second time in that adventure, the unwilling subject of peril. Holmes had gone to confer with a source whose discretion demanded privacy, and I, left to my own devices, resolved to walk along the embankment before returning to my lodgings. The river lay black and sluggish, its vapours rising in ghostly coils, and the warehouses loomed like shadowed sentinels upon the water's edge. As I moved through those deserted streets, I became aware of a peculiar hush, broken only by the lap of the Thames against the timbers. It was then that I fancied the echo of a footstep behind me. At first I dismissed it as imagination, but the sound grew more insistent, keeping pace with my own. My heart quickened, and I turned sharply, yet the fog yielded no form. Pressing on, I entered a narrow lane between warehouses, hoping to shorten my route. No sooner had I advanced a few yards than figures materialized from the mist, hemming me in with silent menace. One seized my arm, another pressed a hand to my throat, and I realized with a shock that their intention was not robbery, but silence, final and irrevocable. I struggled, striking out with what strength I possessed, and for a moment the melee was desperate. A knife flashed dimly, and I confess that I believed my last hour had come. At that instant, however, a whistle shrilled through the night, and the assailants, startled, loosed their grip. They melted into the fog with practiced speed, vanishing as though the darkness had swallowed them whole. Bruised and shaken, I stumbled towards the sound of approaching steps, my heart swelling with relief as Holmes's tall figure emerged from the vapor, his face stern with suppressed wrath. Holmes supported me with a firm grasp, his eyes scanning the gloom with hawk-like vigilance. "You were followed, Watson," he said gravely. "It was a trap laid with care, and had I not doubled back, the Thames might well have claimed another secret." I attempted to speak, but he silenced me with a gesture. "No matter the particulars now. What is important is the revelation it affords. Our adversary is not content to observe. He strikes. And mark this, Watson. The attack was planned with precision, its execution timed to my absence. He knows our movements, anticipates our steps. In such foresight lies a mind as subtle and dangerous as any we have encountered." His words chilled me more than the night air, for I knew too well the weight they carried. Holmes, who so seldom conceded equality in intellect, here acknowledged an enemy of uncommon craft. We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes deep in thought, his gaze fixed upon some inward vision. At length he spoke. "There is design in all this. The forged letters, the stolen journal, the attempt upon your life. They are parts of a whole, arranged by one who weaves his threads with patient cunning. The web tightens, Watson, but we are not yet caught within it. If anything, its constriction reveals the hand that spins it." I saw that his lips were set with grim determination, and the fire in his eyes told me that danger only sharpened his resolve. For my own part, I could not shake the conviction that we moved within sight of a foe whose vigilance never slept. Holmes's preparations for the denouement were as thorough as they were mysterious. For 2 days he scarcely quitted our rooms, save to dispatch urgent messages, and when at last he revealed his plan to me, it was with the calm assurance of one who sees his prey already trembling in the net. "Watson," said he, "we must return to Bloomsbury. The study where the crime was committed shall itself serve as the theatre of exposure. Nothing so unsettles the guilty mind as the echo of its own deeds within familiar walls." That evening found us once more in the sombre house, whose shuttered windows and echoing corridors lent an air of sepulchral gravity to the occasion. By Holmes's design, all the principal figures had been summoned there: Lady Eleanor Rivington, stately though uneasy; Professor Calthorpe, his keen eyes flashing with disdain; Julius Blackwood, attempting to mask his disquiet with forced joviality; and young Geoffrey Hale, whose pale countenance betrayed both fear and hope. Inspector Lestrade, persuaded by Holmes of the necessity, was present with 2 of his men, though he still muttered scepticism under his breath. The ostensible pretext was simple. Holmes had promised to read aloud the rediscovered journal, recently restored from memory and notes, in order to determine its import. Chairs were set about the desk, and the company arranged themselves with reluctant curiosity. The air was thick with tension, and I confess that I myself felt a thrill of anticipation, for I knew too well that Holmes's true object was not recital, but revelation. Holmes took his place at the desk, the journal before him, and cast a sweeping glance over the assembly. "We are gathered," said he, "not merely to peruse the writings of a dead man, but to give voice to one silenced by treachery. Let us listen, therefore, not to me, but to the echoes of truth which Scotland Yard was compelled to forget." At these words, A restless movement passed through the company, and I observed more than one face blanch beneath its mask of composure. Holmes began his recital in a tone so calm, so measured, that it seemed at first no more than the impartial reading of history. Yet as his words advanced, a curious spell took hold of the room. With a precision that chilled the blood, he reconstructed the fatal evening, every phrase carrying with it the weight of certainty. Dr. Edmund Hale, said Holmes, was at work upon his manuscript, a task which threatened reputations of the highest order. A visitor arrived, unannounced, unacknowledged, yet admitted by the scholar himself. They conversed long, their tones at times rising in dispute. At length, the visitor, finding argument unavailing, resorted to a subtler weapon. A candle was lit, charged with a vapour so cunningly contrived that its victim would appear to fall by natural infirmity. The room grew heavy with the poison, and the historian's heart faltered. Yet still he clung to life, and in that struggle, the desk bore the scratches of his effort, and the floor drank his final blood. At this, a visible shudder passed through Lady Rivington, though she strove to compose herself. Blackwood shifted uneasily, the forced smile deserting him. Only Calthorpe sat motionless, his features set in an expression of disdain. Holmes's voice continued, inexorable as fate. The housekeeper, though disregarded, heard the cry. The journal, hidden in secrecy, later betrayed its existence by the very fear it inspired, and was stolen in a desperate attempt at suppression. Yet even theft proclaims the hand of the guilty, for who but he who trembles at exposure seeks to destroy the evidence? Here he paused, his gaze sweeping the assembly. I have spoken thus far as though from conjecture, yet every detail I have named rests upon proof. The chemical traces upon the candle, the forged letters meant to entrap Lady Rivington, the silence imposed upon Scotland Yard. These are not shadows, but links in a chain which points unerringly to the truth. The silence in the room was profound. One could hear the ticking of the clock upon the mantel, each beat like the stroke of a hammer. Hale's hands trembled, and I myself felt the uncanny power of Holmes's words, as though the dead scholar stood among us, demanding justice. Holmes laid the journal upon the desk with deliberate care. Such was the night, ladies and gentlemen. Each of you had cause to dread Dr. Hale's revelations, but only one among you possessed the motive strong enough and the courage cold enough to silence him forever. At this, I saw beads of perspiration stand upon more than one brow, and the tension in the chamber reached a pitch at which every breath seemed a question waiting to be answered. Holmes's calm recital had already unsettled our company, but now he altered his tone. From measured narration he passed into pointed inquiry, directing his gaze successively upon each listener, and with every glance the strain deepened. Lady Eleanor, said he suddenly, you warned Dr. Hale that his work pursued shadows too perilous. Was it fear for his safety or for your own? The lady started, her hand tightening upon her chair. I feared for him, she stammered. Holmes turned away without reply, as though dismissing her defence. His eyes fixed next upon Blackwood. And you, sir? What of the colonial ventures which Dr. Hale investigated? His revelations would have wrought ruin in the market. Did you rejoice at his silence? Blackwood flushed scarlet, muttered something inaudible, and a bead of perspiration glistened upon his temple. At last, Holmes's gaze settled upon Professor Calthorpe. And you, sir, his rival in scholarship, a single publication of his would have demolished your life's work. Tell us, do you feel no gratitude to the chance which relieved you of so formidable an adversary? Calthorpe smiled thinly. Chance, Mr. Holmes, has ever favoured the bold. There was a murmur at this remark, and I saw Lestrade lean forward with sudden attention. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, then resumed in a voice like steel. Ladies and gentlemen, guilt seldom confesses itself with words. It betrays itself in glances, in gestures, in the tremor of a hand. Observe your neighbour, watch the restless shifting of the eye, and ask yourself who here dreads exposure. The silence which followed was broken only by the nervous cough of Blackwood and the sharp intake of breath from Lady Eleanor. Yet Calthorpe alone sat motionless, his eyes fixed upon Holmes with a defiance that seemed born not of innocence, but of desperate resolution. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though satisfied. "The facade is cracking, Watson. Soon the edifice shall fall." Holmes rose now from his chair, the journal still in his hand, and addressed us with a quiet authority that commanded every ear. "The truth is plain," said he. "Professor Calthorpe engineered this crime. He alone possessed the motive powerful enough, the preservation of his reputation, the shielding of his fraudulent scholarship. He knew that Dr. Hale was prepared to demonstrate the falsity of his theories by exposing forged documents upon which his fame depended. To silence him, he devised a method as cunning as it was cruel." Calthorpe sprang to his feet, his face dark with passion. "This is calumny," he cried. "I will not endure." Holmes's hand shot up imperiously. "You will endure until justice itself pronounces upon you. Consider the evidence. The poisoned candle, prepared with a scientific knowledge such as you alone among the suspects possessed. The theft of the journal, executed to erase the proof of your treachery. The forged letters, intended to direct suspicion toward Lady Rivington. Each device bears the stamp of your ingenuity." For the first time, I observed a flicker of uncertainty cross the professor's features. His lips parted as though to protest again, but no words emerged. Holmes pressed his advantage. "You were bold, Professor, but too bold. In your eagerness to remove suspicion from yourself, you overplayed your hand. The attempt upon Dr. Watson's life, the tampering with my cab, these betray a desperation born not of innocence, but of fear." A murmur ran through the company, and even Lestrade could no longer conceal his conviction. Calthorpe's hands gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white, his eyes darting from face to face like a hunted animal. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. "You are the assassin of Dr. Edmund Hale, and the architect of all that followed. Deny it if you will, but the chain is complete, and every link is yours." Holmes, with a composure that belied the intensity of the moment, drew from his pocket a sealed envelope. He laid it upon the desk with deliberate care. "There remains but one proof," said he. "The letter Dr. Hale prepared on the very eve of his death, naming the forgeries and the man responsible. It was never dispatched, but hidden, and here it is." At these words, Calthorpe's eyes flashed with sudden fire. He leaned forward involuntarily, his hand twitching as though drawn by an irresistible impulse. In that instant, the mask of disdain fell from him, and what remained was naked fear. Holmes's gaze never wavered. He said nothing, only waited. The silence grew unbearable, and then, as though unable to resist, Calthorpe darted forward and seized the letter. A cry of triumph broke from Holmes. "You see, Lestrade, the trap has sprung. An innocent man has no need to snatch at shadows. This letter is but a decoy of my own contriving, yet our learned professor could not restrain himself. He has written his confession in the very eagerness of his act." At Holmes's signal, Lestrade's men stepped from the shadows and grasped Calthorpe firmly by either arm. He struggled, his features distorted with rage, but the strength had gone out of him. Holmes replaced the envelope calmly in his pocket. "The case is ended, Watson. Truth, though long suppressed, has at last prevailed. And let this serve as a lesson, that the hand which forges, poisons, and deceives must in the end be undone by the very cunning it employs." When at last Professor Calthorpe had been removed in custody, we returned to Baker Street. There, in the calm after the storm, Holmes laid before us the chain of reasoning which had guided him with such unerring precision. "You will recall, Watson," said he, "that our first intimation of foul play lay not in testimony nor in papers, but in a simple candle stub. To your eye, it seemed no more than an object of common use, but to mine it spoke as eloquently as a witness in the dock. Its irregular burn, the unnatural depth of guttering, betrayed the presence of a foreign substance. The chemist's art confirmed what my suspicion first suggested, that the wax had been impregnated with an alkaloid so subtle that, once vaporized, it attacked the heart whilst leaving the outward appearance of natural failure. Thus did our learned professor employ the scholar's lamp as the very instrument of death. I could not but shudder as Holmes spoke, for I saw again the dim study, the guttered wax, and the silent figure who had drawn his last breath beneath its glow. Mark the ingenuity, Watson. To a superficial glance, the death was of the kind to which elderly men are ever liable. The Yard, eager for simplicity, embraced the verdict of heart failure. Yet had they but tested the candle, the truth would have cried out to them. It is a lesson, my dear fellow, that the smallest relic, examined with care, may unmask the craftiest deception. Holmes next directed my attention to the marks upon the historian's desk. "You will remember the faint scratches, Watson," said he, "which your eyes at first overlooked, but which to me were as legible as handwriting. Their position told a tale. They lay not where pen or paper would naturally rest, but upon the side, as though some heavy object had been dragged suddenly across the surface. That object was none other than the poisoned candle itself, overturned in the scholar's final struggle for breath. In his agony he sought to reach the air, and in so doing he displaced the instrument of his death. It was the resistance of that effort which scored the wood." He paused a moment, his long fingers tracing the memory of the lines in the air. To Scotland Yard such details were invisible, but to the trained eye they bespoke intrusion, an unnatural death, a desperate last gesture. Had they combined this sign with the testimony of the housekeeper, who heard the cry, the truth would have been plain. Yet the silence of the room was mistaken for peace, and so the scratches, eloquent in their accusation, were ignored. Once more, Watson, we see how crime, however cunningly contrived, leaves its indelible script upon the stage of its performance. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression one of mingled triumph and severity. "But even with the candle and the scratches, Watson, the crime might have lain forever concealed, had not the machinery of justice itself been bent to corruption. The certificate of death was signed with undue haste, and the verdict of heart failure entered at the urging of powerful friends. Calthorpe, whose reputation and fortune trembled upon the historian's disclosures, could count upon allies in high places. Their interest was to still the scandal, and the simplest means was to pronounce the affair closed before suspicion could be aroused." I exclaimed at such duplicity, but Holmes only shrugged. "It is not the first time, nor will it be the last, that influence has weighed more heavily than evidence. Yet truth, though delayed, is seldom extinguished. By revisiting the scene, by listening where others dismissed, by testing where others assumed, we restored the voice of the dead. That is our task, Watson, and though it win us little gratitude from officialdom, it is work which must be done if justice is to breathe." As he spoke, I felt anew the profound respect with which his intellect inspired me. He was at once the scourge of the guilty and the champion of the forgotten, recalling to light that which others had conspired to bury. Holmes next addressed the matter of the missing journal, that phantom volume whose theft had so nearly plunged young Geoffrey Hale into despair. "You recall, Watson, how the book vanished from under our very eyes," said he, his fingers steepled in thought. "The swiftness of that act was proof not merely of vigilance, but of fear. Had the journal contained nothing of import, why risk exposure to remove it? Why track Mr. Hale so relentlessly unless its pages held matter dangerous to the guilty? Theft, in this instance, was confession." I nodded, remembering the shadowed figure dissolving into the fog, and the look of anguish upon Hale's face when he discovered the loss. "The journal," Holmes continued, "contained but fragmentary entries, yet they sufficed to indicate the scholar's direction. They hinted at the forged documents, the political scandal, and the rival whose theories stood upon false foundations. Calthorpe recognized that even suspicion would damn him, and so he struck, first at the uncle, then at the evidence, and lastly at ourselves. The sequence is as logical as the steps of a mathematical problem. Holmes's tone hardened. But logic is a merciless foe to such men. The very act of seizing the journal betrayed the professor's hand. He feared discovery more keenly than he feared pursuit, and in that fear he revealed himself. As Holmes spoke, I found myself reflecting upon the singular quality of his pursuit. He was not content to expose crimes of present menace. He gave equal devotion to those which time and authority had conspired to bury. Where others turned away, he turned inexorably toward the truth, guided not by favour or advantage, but by a stern fidelity to justice. In my long association with him, I had seen many instances of his intellectual triumphs, yet seldom had I been so moved as on this occasion. Here was a case which the world had forgotten, a death dismissed, a man's honour smothered beneath official indifference. Yet Holmes had raised the dead voice, had compelled the living to answer, and had torn aside the veil woven by influence and deceit. I confess that my heart swelled with admiration, not only for his genius, but for the moral courage which drove it. For beneath his cold exterior, there burned a relentless conviction that no crime, however cleverly concealed, ought to pass into silence while one mind remained to challenge it. Holmes rose and paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his features grave. At length, he spoke with the weight of one delivering judgment. "The true danger, Watson, is not in crimes committed, but in crimes forgotten. Memory is the sharpest blade against falsehood. Men may bribe officials, destroy papers, or silence witnesses, yet they cannot wholly erase the record from the fabric of events. It is for us to listen where others are deaf, to remember where others forget. In the end, it is memory which condemns." The words lingered in the air with solemn force, and I felt their truth strike deeply. For had not Scotland Yard itself been blinded by forgetfulness, or worse, by deliberate neglect? And had not Holmes, by the simple act of remembering, restored life to the silent testimony of candle and floorboard, journal and cry? In the days that followed, Scotland Yard was compelled, by the weight of Holmes's demonstration, to reopen the case. Inspector Lestrade, though chafing at the necessity, could not but acknowledge the cogency of the evidence, and official recognition was at last accorded to that which had so long been smothered. Geoffrey Hale, his spirit restored, vowed to complete and publish his uncle's unfinished work, that the truth which had cost so dear should not again be lost to silence. His gratitude toward Holmes was beyond measure, though Holmes himself waved it aside with his accustomed indifference to praise. For my own part, I close my notes with a reflection which has often returned to me since, that truth is a fragile thing, easily obscured by power, prejudice, or neglect, yet endowed with a tenacity which no artifice can wholly suppress. And I thanked Providence that my friend, with his unyielding intellect and steadfast heart, had once more recalled justice from the brink of oblivion. Holmes sat back in his chair, the glow of the fire catching the sharp lines of his profile. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the gravest peril in this case was not the poison nor the forgeries, but the eagerness of authority to forget. Oblivion is the ally of falsehood, while remembrance is its undoing. That is why we must remember, even when the world prefers to look away." I could not deny the truth of his words. The silence that followed was weighty, broken only by the ticking of the clock. And now, dear listener, let me put a question to you. What do you believe was Professor Calthorpe's greatest mistake? His crime itself, or his desperate attempt to conceal it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this tale of Holmes has gripped you, I invite you to subscribe for more mysteries and pass it along to friends who love a puzzle well told. For in every shadowed case, another secret waits to be unveiled.